everyone. Welcome everyone to ATW's Executive Leadership Forum. We're so glad you're here. And session 5, it's going to be listening to a great conversation about examining culture, facilitating transparency to bring about lasting change. I'm Suzanne Millette. I am the Director of Great Minds for ATW. So this event will support programs for Great Minds and leadership development for the women members as well. ATW is changing the face of women technology. As you know, our mission is to increase the number of women in leadership and strengthen the pipeline of girls entering the STEM fields. We do this through educational programs such as this, so thank you for being here. All funds raised from our event will go to our Great Minds program, which is a community outreach program targeted for young underserved girls to help them become interested in STEM, help them retain the interest in STEM as well. So, by the way, we have some great programs coming up in the fall, although we're virtual. So please just keep watch on the Great Minds. We do provide direct scholarship to send girls to various camps. We have tailored programs for the girls to learn leadership skills. It's a new program that's coming up, so I'm very excited about that. So enough of that. Thank you for being here. Let's begin our session. Just a quick note while our speakers are presenting, please take advantage and use the Q&A that's on the right of your screen to enter any questions or vote on another participant's questions if you're interested in hearing about that as well. We'll have a few minutes toward the end of the session to review those questions for the panel for STAR to address. So right now I want to introduce Kim Timms. She's with MuleSoft, and she'll kick off the interview with Star Carter. Star, if you've not had a chance to read about her, she's the co-founder and COO and general counsel for Canaries. Canaries is an online platform for individual contributors to post anonymously, rate and review surveys on diversity and inclusion at their current and former employers. Prior to that, she's very passionate about ensuring workplace culture is safe and welcoming for our employees. So this is very, very timely interview. This would be a great discussion to hear about. Prior to Canary, she served as associate counsel at Hudson Advisors LP, and she's been a counsel also at Sidley Austin LLP, another large firm. So we're so happy you're here with us today, Star. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to hearing this important conversation. So thank you. I'm going to hand this off to Kim.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne, for that introduction. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Star, for joining us here today. So let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
So Suzanne gave us a high level of what you do at Canaries or about Canaries. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're currently doing, and where did you previously work? But most importantly, like what inspired you to start the company?
Yeah. So let me start the conversation and explain a little bit about Canaries. A lot of people say canaries. They don't really know how to. And I think part of that is because I have a lawyer background, same with one of my two other co-founders, and we wanted to create something unique so that we could trademark it. That's our little lawyer brains working on that. So it's canaries, like the bird, and it's really taken a word and a play off of canary in a coal mine. So back in the day, miners used to take canaries down. They could detect toxic gas or carbon monoxide long before the human body. And that's what we're really doing. We're first alerters, both for individual employees and for companies, because biases, discrimination, areas of opportunity when it comes to these types of things can be hard to detect. And that's what we're doing. We're helping companies detect these things within their own workforce. And so what inspired me to help start Canaries with my two other co-founders? It really is a lot of my experience in the workplace. So Suzanne Suzanne did a good job announcing all my past stuff. But basically, I am a recovered lawyer, right? I used to do only law, and I still practice law as a general counsel too, but that's not my primary function. And during those experiences when I was in law, I experience specific workplace inequities. And that's nothing new, that's nothing unique. As you talk to people of color, other diverse individuals, you start hearing these same stories over and over again. So it became very clear to me as I talked to my co-founders and we put together this idea that something has to be done about that. And what we came up with and what we thought was the best way to address that was to put data and analytics in the center of diversity, equity, and inclusion. These can be hard topics to talk about, right? And they can be emotional. And so with the way that we're doing it through our technology platform, we're trying to remove that emotional component to diversity and inclusion, focus on the data because the data doesn't lie, and then provide the resources and the infrastructure with respect to the help based on the data that we find to help inform the strategy and to implement strategy related to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow, that is very impressive. And I know from a background of tech, data actually tells a story. So I always look at the statistics. So with your co-founders, you all have raised more than $1 million in funding, right? And according to PitchBook, Black women only received 0.6% of the venture capitalist funding in 2018, which is the year that you all founded the company. What was your experience like as a Black woman fundraising?
Kim, it wasn't easy. You know, the same things that we're trying to fight against, these inequities that exist, they exist in the VC landscape and the entrepreneurial landscape in itself. So, which I wasn't aware of. Like before this, right? I wasn't in the entrepreneurial world. I enter it and I'm seeing, very similar patterns that I saw in the corporate world. And it just became very clear to us that not only do we need to address diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, but in all kinds of silos in society, including the entrepreneurial silo. So to answer your question, it wasn't easy. I remember very clearly talking to a VC who straight up looked at me and said, it's, at the time it was 2019. It's 2019. Do we really need diversity, equity, inclusion? I mean, everything's a meritocracy now. And of course, this is before the inflection point of George Floyd and this renewed focus on social justice. But of course, my co-founders and I looked at each other and said, yeah, this is probably not going to be the best fit for us. So it's been hard. And as always, with the background in law, I turned to research. And what I found is that female entrepreneurs oftentimes get questions that are called preventive questions. And these are questions that focus on the negative. What's the worst case scenario for you and your earnings this year? Why male entrepreneurs are often called what they call promotion questions. And so that's the sky the limit questions. What's the best case scenario of the money that you think you could earn this year? Tell me how X is positioning your company in a positive way. So it took some work, and we've taken a lot of practice in spinning what we have seen as a lot of preventive questions to promotion type answers, because those promotion questions beget promotion answers and vice versa for the preventive, because it's hard. And we know that there's differences and we're graded in a different way, especially as African-American, Black female founders. So it hasn't been easy. We have found some very good success in raising the money, and we're very proud of that. But the fight continues. We continue to work on our next fundraising round, for instance, and we're sure to come across more barriers like that. And hopefully we can address those. And just like in the workplace, address those inequities and hope that the VC industry really focuses on this, just like other industries are at least seemingly doing, and working on funding more Black founders, more female founders, and fill in the demographic of any demographic that gets substantially less than their counterparts.
Awesome. Wow. So you all have really overcome just even in your first couple of years. What do you think we can do as a society or to change that dynamic? Because I know there's a lot going on currently. What are some things that you all have done or that you have noticed that we can do?
Yeah, so that's that's a tough question. I know for VC firms specific, I think that they can definitely, and I think this bleeds over to other uh, respects of our society. But I think one thing is intentionality. I think with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, you have to be intentional. You have to think, I'm focused on belonging, which is the outcome of these things: diversity, equity, inclusion. Belonging is the outcome of those. And focused on getting a positive outcome and laying the foundation to get there, to get the belonging, to achieve the equity. I think it's very important that you're intentional. And I think that's true of the VC firm, VC industry. I think VC firms have to collectively say, we've got to do better. We're looking at our statistics and things aren't matching up. There's a disproportionate amount of funding that we're giving specific founders and specific demographics. And we need to be intentional that we are setting policies and procedures in a way that's fair, that's equitable, and does not have a disparate impact on, Black founders or female founders or wherever you find the disproportionate effect of funding between those demographics.
Wow. Which is a great segue into our next question.
Yeah.
So we know that this year has been an inflection point around race and equity, with calls for action across the workplaces in America due to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the inequities presented by COVID-19. So how is this year different from past movements? And do you really think it will lead to a lasting change?
Yeah.
And I know my company, I work for MuleSoft, which is Salesforce. We were one of the first tech companies to actually take a stance in that. And then other companies kind of follow suit.
Yeah, I saw that, which is very good. Because a lot of companies haven't come out with a statement at all, and now sometimes has passed. And of course, we've seen George Floyd, but we've seen various other events, similar events, happen since then. So it's very important. I do think 2020 has been a heck of a year. It's going to go down in the history books. We've dealt with the COVID, the viral pandemic that has highlighted inequities for specific demographics. There's inequities with respect to the disabled community. There's all kinds of inequities that have been highlighted for Black and brown people. So we have that pandemic going on. Then we have our second pandemic, which is really an ongoing racial pandemic. And at this point, it was really the inflection point of George Floyd, which again was an inflection point because we've seen this over and over again. I think the Washington Post has said, approximately 1,260 Black people have been killed at the hands of police brutality since 2015. But George Floyd was an inflection point. Why? Probably because the egregious murder was caught on camera this time, and people were seeing it firsthand. So I will say, for better or worse, with the murder of George Floyd, what we've seen is this inflection point. We've seen people take a stance, no matter what they look like, Caucasian males, females, fill in the demographic, but the inflection point has created this mobilization, this empowerment, and not just because the focus is really on the Black community. So not just on the Black community with this inflection point, but across the board, across society. So I will say that this feels different. It feels different, and I think we're going to see lasting change. At least I hope so. Of course, as a Black female, this stuff's heavy, and I could wallow in it and really get depressed thinking about these inequities that exist, seeing these things happen to my brothers and sisters at the hands of police. But instead, I try to focus on the silver lining and think, okay, well, the good thing about this is that it's mobilizing people. I'm seeing these peaceful protests, and I'm seeing not just Black people out there. I'm seeing a little bit of everything out there. And we're really getting some mobilization. So I try to look at that silver lining, but I do feel like it's different. And I'm hoping it's not just a moment, it's a movement. And whether the change will be lasting, it's too early to tell. But I think it's up to us as individuals to make sure it does. And the only way to do that is we continue demanding, workplaces. We continue demanding from our elected officials. We continue signing those petitions. We continue to demand folks and institutions to do better.
Yes. And going back to your last response, being intentional.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Tie it all together, Kim. Tie it all together.
So kind of going on that topic, many companies have issued the statements in supporting, right? Is that not enough? What are some of the first steps companies actually can take to truly create that lasting change? So not just talking about it, but how do I act on it?
Yes. So for me, I think companies making statements, awesome. I feel like that is a must at the very least. But what we have to and what we have to push for is that not only is there an external statement made about racial justice, and it's great that folks are taking a stance, but also we're very clear and transparent as corporate workplaces to talk about what are the actual actions we're putting into place to try to see these changes. And not only that, are we practicing what we preach? Are we making sure that diversity, equity, inclusion within our own four walls, our own organization, is it prioritized? Because the last thing you want to do is come out and make this statement for racial justice externally, and then you have, and especially because again, the focus right now is the Black community. And especially having Black employees specifically, and then these Black employees within your own organization continue to experience inequities. They continue to see that the promotional process is not a fair process from their perspective. They continue to see that diversity, equity, inclusion is just a marketing ploy, and it's not a true focus really with putting your employees' support in mind. So it's so important that you are being genuine as an executive team at a company, and you're walking the walk, you're talking the talk. So what can you do? What steps can you do to actually move this forward as a company? And it's not easy, right? There's no like perfect answer, and I definitely think there's things that a company can do. For instance, one, really be critical and intentional, as we talked about. But let's look at your numbers. Diversity is really important, right? Let's look at your numbers. Where do they fall? Because representation matters. And it's so important that you have representation and true diversity, right? Like things beyond race and gender, which of course are important to me as a Black woman, but looking at things like, do you have veterans? Do you have disabled? What's your LGBTQ plus? Things of that nature of diversity, and making sure your numbers are truly representative of diversity. And I'm not talking about just the organization. I'm talking about from the bottom all the way up to the top. Because what a lot of companies do, they say we're diverse, right? And they have diverse numbers when they chunk them all together. But when you break it down by position, they're all at the entry level position. So make sure the numbers are there. And also don't do what companies have been doing historically, which is focusing on the numbers only. Don't forget about the equity and the inclusion part, because you're going to spend all this money recruiting diverse individuals, and then they're going to leave, right? If they don't feel like they belong. And so the second question would be equity. Are your policies and procedures equitable? Be intentional. Look at them closely. Take a critical look at them and look at it from a systemic point of view. These unconscious bias trainings are great, but that's an individual intervention. You have to look at your whole system. And a lot of these companies are hundreds of years old, and they get used to the same patterns and procedure. And when you say, well, why do we do it like this? The answer is, that's how we've always done it. And there's no kind of analysis looking deep and seeing, does your policy, despite appearing to be facially neutral, doesn't have a disparate impact on a specific demographic. And third, inclusion, right? This part is kind of the most nebulous concept, and that's what we do at Canaries with companies. We help companies measure inclusion so that they can benchmark how they're doing over time, and they can compare themselves to other companies. So measure, see how you're doing with inclusion, support your employees, and make sure that your employees are feeling like they belong, and really being critical and intentional at all three of those things. And if you do that, you'll be well on the road to starting to build a truly diverse and inclusive workplace.
I absolutely love that. I can speak from experience. I know we personally created a task force, and kind of going back to what you said about data and measuring, we actually have published, okay, here's what our goals for achieving increased diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it also holds leadership accountable when you publish that so that you can measure where you are. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I do have a question. So today, for the people that are listening, what can individuals tuning in today do to create the change?
Yeah. So, it shouldn't be incumbent on individuals within a workplace to create change in the workplace. That should fall on leadership and be pushed down. But there are things that I think we need to do, especially because we're feeling more mobilized to do things as individuals. And so I really think, one, you can do things, and I hit up on this in some ways. Really focus on things you can do as an individual, like donating to specific causes, signing the petitions, joining those peaceful protests. I think all those are important. If you're part of an ERG, an employee resource group, or an affinity group, being part of those talks, leading those, getting your affinity group to mobilize to ask those questions of your executive leader, ask them to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, put in an anti-racist policy if your company doesn't have one. So I think it's really, really important to that. I think individuals can also show they're inclusive by doing simple things like adding your pronouns to your email signature, showing that you're supportive of using pronouns and having that. And that's something hopefully you could be able to do without a lot of pushback or problems. I think the most important thing as an individual, though, is when you're in the workplace and you actually observe an inequity happening. And it can be as simple as, and I've been in this situation where you have yourself and another colleague, and the person in charge, the supervisor, is questioning your answer and your credibility, but not asking the other person. And that's something I've experienced firsthand. If you see that, butting in and saying, hey, and you have to do it in a respectful way, right? You're in the workplace, so it's not like you can be rude, or especially to your supervisor. But hey, I noticed you're asking Star a lot of questions about her stance. I'd love to explain a little bit about my stance as well. It's a polite way, but it's like, hey, you're asking Star, you didn't ask me, but in a polite way. So speak up. It does a huge disservice to not say anything. And I've been in a situation too where I've had employees come by my office and say, ooh, that was strange. That was strange. I don't know why they asked that for you. And I'm thinking, me neither. It would have been great if you had said something right then and there in a polite way.
Right.
So I think as individuals, we can do all kinds of betterment for creating a culture that's more inclusive if we aren't afraid to speak up when we're observing the inequities right then and there. I think that's the most important thing an individual can do within their workplace.
Wow. So being supportive, I like it. Support your fellow employees or your peers.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I'm not maybe two more questions. So what is your hope for the future with Canaries in the workplace? And will the future of workplaces be more equitable?
So for me, my hope is that individuals feel empowered. I hate that specifically diverse individuals sometimes feel like they have to hide a certain part of them to make others feel comfortable. So my hope is that in the future, everybody can really bring their authentic self to work and bring it all 100% without being afraid that they'll be judged negatively or there will be negative career ramifications for them. My hope is that companies step up and say, you know what, we are going to prioritize diversity and inclusion. We're not just going to say it after we make a statement. We're going to take the steps necessary to implement and look at our policies and procedures and measure inclusion and benchmark and make sure we're treating diversity, equity, inclusion as we would any other business unit, which would require measurement and making sure you benchmark against yourself. And I think on a personal note, I have 2 kids. And so really a workplace where they're not having to experience these inequities that I experience, that it's a true meritocracy, that they can go in, work hard, and there isn't any behind the scenes reason why they're not moving and progressing in their career. And they're doing so at the same rate as anyone else who works the same amount and works as hard at their job.
It's so funny you should say that. So I do have a daughter who's actually has a job, and she's actually experiencing that right now. And it saddens me that she's experiencing what I experienced, right? And so I'm like, I don't even know how to coach her. I know how to coach her, but I shouldn't have to be coaching her through this right now. So I absolutely get where you're coming from.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Hopefully, we get to a point where my kids are young; they're 4 and 6. So I'm hoping by the time they enter the workforce, some of this has been corrected. But we'll see. And I'm sorry your daughter's going through that, because it's disheartening to say, "Wow, I experienced this, and X amount of years later, I'm seeing the same thing. Why haven't we seen progress? Why is DEI so stagnant at this point?"
Absolutely. I always say make it better for the next generation, right? That's
Absolutely.
what I'm working for, the next generation, make it better. So
Yes.
this has been an awesome interview. Where can people find more information and or get in touch with Canaries?
Yeah. So of course we have our website. That's www.canaries.com. And again, it's spelled a little funky. So it's Kanarys. And yes, we do know how to spell, .com. And on that site, you'll see a lot of our transparent front facing where you can leave anonymous reviews if you want to. We also have an employer section, which is a little bit different. It's our workplace analytics, where we work with companies. We're sending out assessments. We're providing DEI consulting, and it's all based around the data and analytics and our technology platform. So there's an employer portion for those who are interested from the employer perspective versus an employee perspective. And then, of course, we're on all the major social media platforms, with a handle at Canaries, again, funky spelling, INC, Inc. So you can find us there. And then, of course, I'm on LinkedIn and all the major platforms, and I put it in my little profile picture thingy. I'm trying to get used to all this technology here. And so you can hit me up on the LinkedIn separately as well, in addition to the Canaries pages.
Awesome. And I love the creativity with the name. So
Oh, thank you.
absolutely. So I guess we can open it up to questions from our attendees. And Suzanne, I don't know if you want to jump back in or if you want me to go through it, but I can start it off. So I
Great.
see one Q&A. It says, what do you recommend people say when they have suggested an idea and then someone else, usually a white male, says the same thing and the white male gets the credit?
Oh, that is such a tough question, and I've seen it a million times. It's hard because the additional factor you have to deal with if you call it out is, you're judged a certain way for being angry, or for me, an angry Black woman, oh, calling this out, you're just you're judged upon different standards a lot of times. What I've come to see as a way to address this is, kind of politely raise my hand and say, that's great. When I mentioned about 30 minutes ago the idea of blah, 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 that's exactly what I was talking about. So complimenting them, because again, and I hate this, I hate that we have to, and it's part of it's being in the workplace. And I do feel like people aren't worried about stepping on toes anymore. But I think if you are one of those people that want to acknowledge this but not do in a way to step toes still, I know a lot of people are feel more mobilized and don't care anymore. But if you are, I would acknowledge what they said, say it's great, and connect it to what you said earlier. So say, I hear you, that's a great idea, that's very similar to what I mentioned 30 minutes ago, where I said blah blah blah, and what you're saying is exactly what I was getting at. So it's a way to reinforce, yes, this is what I said. I'm complimenting you, but I'm also reminding everybody in the room that I'm tying it back to what I previously mentioned to folks.
I absolutely love that. All right, we have one more. It says, Star, how would an employer engage Canaries and what type of data do you provide them? Do you prescribe next steps for them to improve?
Yeah. So if an employer is interested in Canaries, it could be as simple as shooting me an email, or there's a link on our site on the For Employers page, where you can connect that way, or you can send a direct email to me, star@canaries.com. But yes, we work. What we're trying to do really when we talk to companies, and companies are a lot of companies are everywhere on their DEI journey. Some are at the very beginning. They don't even know where to begin. Others are more advanced. And so what we're trying to do is help companies, especially early in the career, figure out where to start if they don't know where to start. And if they're more advanced, get them to focus on what's important from the employee perspective. So what we do is a lot of collaboration where we are working on an employer assessment, an employee assessment, so that we can build out a baseline assessment and create a benchmark. And from that information, because again, data analytics is so important, from what we find from that baseline assessment that we send out, both from the employer and the employee side, we start looking at that to really inform DEI strategy. So at that point, our DEI, our network of DEI professionals, whoever's assigned to this specific account, takes that information and really starts thinking through how do we inform strategy, lay out strategy, and begins the consulting role of using that information so that their strategy that they're suggesting is completely informed. We believe that the most important thing for your employees to feel like they trust the system is communicating, hey, we did these assessments, we hear you, here's what we've seen, and here is what we are doing to address what you all have mentioned as what's important and what you want to see happen. And at that point, you gain your employees' trust. They're believing in the system and they're seeing improvements, and you are doing a good job of communicating that. We also have a communication person on our team who leads up the communication and works with the company on how do we communicate what all we're doing on the DEI front. Because again, it's important that your employees know. You'll be so surprised how many companies have all these great policies, but their employees have no idea. There's a lack of communication in them. So yes, we prescribe next steps, and we also provide assessments for our company partners.
Awesome. Oh, okay, another question has come in. It says, what do you think about mentor pairings? Should we match people with similar backgrounds, or does that potentially limit minority employees away from the power players at the higher levels?
Yes. And so, okay, I think this is a really good question. I'm not sure if it's from like a formal mentor program as an employer or just kind of finding your own mentors. So one, I would say sometimes you don't have a choice, period, right? You don't have anybody that looks like you, excuse me, in the upper levels, which is a common thing depending on what industry you're in. But if you do have that, what I always try to say is, yes, I always tried to find a good mix of mentors. And if there was a Black woman, I was all for using that mentor. But I also am realistic too, because even in times where maybe it wasn't a Black woman, it's a female, it still wasn't a good match. And so it doesn't really matter what that person looks like. I like to think that if it's a Black woman, I'd like to start there and see if that works. But it's so important to build mentors and, more importantly, sponsors that are in the executive lead, that are in executive leadership. And again, and a lot of times it doesn't look like you. So it's important to foster those relationships, especially if your mentor isn't a power player up here. And so to your point about minorities, employees might be losing some of that high level power that you can get from having a mentor or a sponsor up here. You're absolutely right. And so I just try to have a good bench of mentors and sponsors that look different. And of course, if there's a Black woman in power, it's a comfortable place for me. That's where I'd like to start. But I want to emphasize the importance of also finding other mentors and sponsors that don't exactly look like you, especially if there's no one that looks like you that's in power.
Okay. Wow. All right. Well, we don't have any questions, but I think I have one question. So I'm curious to know, I know you all look at statistics and analytics. When you're looking at different industries, have you noticed the disparity, or just like maybe in tech, the diversity is less, or like, and I'm thinking about education because I think about diversity in the schools. I don't know if we've assessed that diversity in the schools, the hospitals, because we know that we're impacted from a health, economic, education across the board.
Yeah.
What are your like observations across those industries?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We're definitely see disparities in numbers among diverse individuals and others in various industries. Tech, I think most people know tech tends to be behind in that. And long before the inflection point of George Floyd, we had people calling out the tech industry specifically and asking why are these numbers so terrible. And there's been all these things put in place to get more, Black girls code and get specific demographics coding from a young age because there's such a disparity. We also see a lot of a lack of numbers in the professional services. So the consulting, the lawyer, the banking, any of those industries where you're providing professional services as your service, as your product, you see a lot of disparities there in numbers. And I think a lot of these industries realize this and are, because I think the inflection point are coming out and saying, as an industry, we have to do better. But in these situations, that's why it's so important to have industry leaders come to the plate. The biggest companies within these silos come to the plate and come out and say, we are the leaders of this industry, and we're going to come together and we are going to focus on diversity and inclusion, because this is a focus not only with us as a company, but we want it to be a focus in the entire industry. But you do see disparities in various industries. And I want to underline the point too, for anyone listening, it's okay if your numbers aren't good, because you know what? Everybody else's numbers aren't good. And so at the beginning, we heard a lot about, well, we're kind of embarrassed. This is before George Floyd. And what's important and what we emphasize is it's okay if your numbers aren't good. But the question is, what are you doing now going forward to ensure that you're putting efforts in and you are doing what you have to and need to change those numbers? It's not enough to say we're embarrassed, we're not going to be transparent, we don't want to talk about diversity and inclusion. You have to, and you have to be intentional, and you have to be okay with where you are. But let's work together now going forward to look at where you are and be honest about it and implement informed strategies so that you're making the changes necessary in order to get your workforce more diverse. And let's face it, we have changing U.S. demographics, right? Minorities the numbers are going higher and higher to the point where it's going to be a majority eventually. So it's so important. And right now we're in COVID, and so talent acquisition may not be the focus, but when we get out of COVID, we get out of what some perceive will be a bad recession, we're going to have this fight for talent again. There will be a talent squeeze. Everyone will be hiring, and you've got to have a diverse and equitable workplace in order to successfully bring in the best talent at that point.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So this pretty much wraps up what we have today. I must say I have enjoyed this discussion. I will be keeping in contact with you, reaching out to you as well. I guess I'll turn it over to Suzanne to take us away.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Star.
Thank you so much, Star. Thank you again. I think this is a great conversation. You provided us some helpful, useful tips to bring about lasting change to our organizations. I'm certainly right there with you, being Mexican American, so I've witnessed this and experienced this myself. So thank you. This is a very timely conversation, and we really appreciate everything.
Great.
All right.
You,
yes, absolutely. So guests, let's return to the main lobby and mingle a little bit with our other participants and attendees, and wait for the next session to start.
Excellent. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Take care.
Okay, bye.